Hello and welcome to the Thrive Meetup. My name is Rowena Moraes and I'm the host of the Thrive Meetup. And I am all about supporting small businesses with their brand positioning, their marketing and communications. And I'm also an employability trainer, assessor, and coach. Now, I started the Thrive Meetups in 2017, hosting them as face-to-face sessions at first, but now running them primarily online. And these are monthly gatherings designed to support your learning, networking, and career journey, help you engage with your larger community. The meetups are open to women from all walks of life, wherever they may be located. So, welcome and thank you for joining us today. My guest is Helen Dalley Fisher, a gender equality consultant and a human rights activist who provides advice and support on gender impact analysis to organizations and the government. Helen will share more today about the work she's currently undertaking with corporations and NGOs on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and much more. So, welcome, Helen. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks. Lovely to be here, Rowena.
Did you want to expand on that very short introduction? Maybe share a little bit about, what you do, who you are, before we get into the DEI stuff directly?
Sure. So I've come from a fairly varied background. I actually started as a lawyer in corporate law, but specializing in the area of discrimination law. And so I've always had a perspective that's come from the question of how we structure things and what exclusion looks like within our communities, within business, and within government. And so it's been a sort of an interesting process for me of working from the perspective of initially advising corporations in relation to discrimination law specifically, through to practicing community law and looking at the way systems like our social security system or our tenancy systems operate to marginalise people, and then moving more specifically into gender equality advocacy. So I ran the Equality Rights Alliance, which is one of the national women's alliances for well over a decade. And as a result of that experience, built a large network of people who are working in the area of trying to see how we can build economies, social structures, political structures that distribute power a little more fairly and are better aligned with the commitments that we've made to human rights, and which work better for us as communities and as businesses or other entities, just in terms of being able to properly get a hold of leverage the benefits that come from really diverse operating environments. So it's been an interesting journey.
Excellent. That's a good introduction. Now talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, let's just call it DEI, although that is probably going to be a tongue twister. Sometimes we understand the value of something when we notice that it's missing, right? So it could be underrepresentation or just biased hiring or exclusion of voices. And I'm particularly interested because we understand that DEI is evolving rapidly in Australia, also the shifts that are occurring in the US. I want to hear, how you're making sense of DEI, particularly in terms of your work and your community. Also wanting to hear more about what you're noticing here in Australia and globally. So maybe we could start with what DEI looks like today from your perspective.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to sort of to note the tongue twister kind of element of the acronym, because the concept is a bit tongue twistery too, because it contains three quite separate elements that are all necessary to be able to say that you're operating in an environment where you don't have unconscious barriers operating to limit the ability of your entity, whatever it might be. So the three parts of it, as are sort of broadly understood right now, are the diversity part, which is about making sure that the mix of people and ideas and backgrounds that are a part of your ecosystem are sufficiently diverse. And the thinking behind that use ecosystem rather than just your company or your environment, is that what we're looking to do is to build an environment where when a challenge comes, and it's an adaptive challenge, so we have technical problems in life and we have adaptive problems. And technical problems are the ones where we know the answer. You break your arm, we know how to fix a broken arm. You do these 4 things. But an adaptive challenge, something like a pandemic coming along, is something where we have to try different solutions, maybe let some things fail, have a go at creatively thinking about what the solutions to the problem might be. And so diversity is about making sure that you have access to the biggest pool of people who might provide different perspectives on the challenges that you're facing. And the flip side to it from the individual perspective is that if you have systems in place that ensure diversity, then you're much more likely to have a workforce where people are valued as individuals, but where people's access to their basic human rights as they appear in the workplace are more easily sort of accessed. And so it's not just about making sure that the people you actively employ are diverse, but that, for example, your client base is diverse, or that your supply chain uses diverse environments. So it's quite a broad concept, but that makes it sound a little bit overwhelming, but it's actually not that difficult over time. Go on.
I was gonna say, because you mentioned systems, so I like the reference to that because it means that it's not just about working off what you're seeing, but also putting certain frameworks into place so that you are better supporting yourself and, being able to deliver. So when you talk systems here, can you give us some examples of what you mean by that?
Yeah. So it can be anything from the processes by which you identify potential talent and hire, the processes that lead to advancement within your organization. So leadership processes, mentoring, what the pathways look like and what's required to actually be able to achieve those pathways. It can be other elements, and I think this is where we get to the other 2 parts of DEI, which is it can be systems of thought. So thinking about the culture in your organization, and particularly the culture in your leadership teams, in the board, in the C-suite, if you're in a much smaller organization, the culture of leadership that sits among people who actually provide leadership in your organization. And I think that's an interesting point to make, that if you're a small or medium entity, where a big organization might be looking at their C-suite and their management level. For a small or medium entity, you might be looking at who steps up, who's the one who gets people together to have the conversations about culture and about, so the way you do things. Might not necessarily be someone in a managerial role. So those questions about culture are also systemic questions. What are your processes for discussing the way you do things and the assumptions that sit underneath the way you do things? And as I was saying, that brings you to those 2 elements of equity and inclusion. So equity being a distinction between the idea of equality, where everybody is treated the same way, and equity, where the outcomes of your processes, the things that you do on a daily basis, is that people end up with roughly equivalent outcomes from those processes. So equality, everyone's treated the same. Equity, everybody gets a similar level of outcome. And the metaphor that I like best in this situation is the 800 meters track race, where people run around a track and you've got, say, 10 lanes. The people on the inside track have a shorter run than the people on the outside track. If you start everybody in a line at the beginning of the race, that's equality. So everybody is starting at the same place. Whereas equity is starting everybody in a staggered line, which allows for everybody to run the same length around the track, because you're recognizing that the track is different for the person on the inside line than it is for the person on the outside.
Absolutely.
And so equity is where we want to get to, rather than equality. And then inclusion being that piece about culture. So making sure that everybody is valued, heard, accepted within, the confines of a process that allows for your business to actually run. So what I'm not saying that everybody needs to, have an opportunity to fully vent every feeling they've ever had, but that your processes and your ways of working are organized in such a way that you recognize that value comes from your workers and from the people that you work alongside. And so how do you build that, sort of a way of operating that means that when people raise issues, that when they bring a perspective that is different, that is understood to be a valuable thing to the company, and is sort of carefully nurtured, if you like. So
Yeah.
those three elements are sort of where we are at the moment. But we're in a funny stage at the moment because we're seeing a real pushback against DEI, particularly coming out of the US. And this is one of those really unfortunate situations where a particular process that we've been going through globally, like DEI is being picked up across the world. Like there's a really interesting program being run by the World Economic Forum, which looks at which establishes sort of landmark lighthouse entities, big corporations that operate globally and that are able to establish strong DEI programs and then participate in a monitoring and evaluation process. And when you look at the map of where those lighthouse entities are, it's global. They're everywhere. And so we're seeing DEI having become extremely mainstream to the point where the research is now showing that rather than being able to point to small benefits for companies that have good DEI practices, we're now able to show active disadvantages to those companies who are not engaging in the space. So it's the figure that usually gets cited is somewhere around 30% improved performance for a company that has a strong DEI practice, particularly around race and gender. Compared to a company that has limited or no engagement with DEI. So roughly above 30% improvement in performance. In retention, in loss of sort of people voluntarily leaving organisations or leaving organisations in circumstances where they don't feel like it was a good experience. So the business case is now pretty strong. The interest in DEI and the engagement in DEI is global. And yet DEI has become the subject of significant attacks, particularly in the US recently. So we've seen Trump with his executive orders. In January, we saw 2 on consecutive days, which were really, really got to the heart of some of the knee-jerk response to DEI, which is, if you look at the titles of them, the first one was Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government, which is about attacking the inclusion of people with gender diverse identities in various federal programs and in private businesses that wanted to engage in government contracts. And the second one, released the day after, was Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity. And that executive order framed diversity, equity, and inclusion rather than being about creating systems and processes in a company that are open to the largest number of people and work for the largest number of people. It then framed DEI as discriminatory. In the sense that it felt that it frames DEI as being an attempt to give certain groups within the population a leg
Yes.
up.
Correct.
So in a way, it's like they're looking at that 800-meter track and going, not everybody starts in the same line. So that pushback that's happening in the US is about trying to reimpose equality over equity. And the result of that has been a really, what I would describe as a bullying campaign, which, and that's not a term I use lightly, but the subsequent fallout from that has involved executive orders being issued by the Trump administration, which specifically target individual corporations and particularly individual law firms, revoking their security status for being able to do government work, ordering government entities to review their current contracts with external providers to determine whether those companies' DEI policies, and then removing contracts, existing contracts, in order to ostracize those entities. And so we've got this real pushback, which we started to feel here in Australia when a number of multinationals started asking the question, well, what do we do about that?
Yes. Yeah.
The interesting thing for me is that US-based pushback has been part of, or sits alongside a problem that emerged a little bit earlier around at the time of the death of George Floyd in the US and the Black Lives Matter building up. There was a lot of social media pressure on companies to jump into the DEI space and to show that they had DEI credentials.
That's right.
But that work wasn't necessarily done systematically or with real commitment. It was more of a knee-jerk reaction to external pressure. And so we have seen some really poor DEI processes, which have tended more towards that equality rather than equity approach, and as a result have had poor results. And so seeing those two things together, this ideological attack on DEI, which is based in some racist and misogynist views about the way the world should work, alongside a bit of a recent history about companies finding DEI rather than an opportunity as a burden that they have to take on for fear of being attacked, has created a really unhelpful environment for DEI. And I think that it's been really heartening for me to see the Australian pushback against the pushback, because the response in Australia has been to lean into the business case by and large and to say, but if I don't do this, my business is worse off.
Yeah.
And that's coming through not just from big businesses for whom this is all a lot easier in some ways. It's also harder because the scope they're working over is
That's
big.
right.
But they've got more resources. But even small to medium enterprises are going there.
Yes. And I was going to say that. Look, the thing is, the more we get into this topic, the more I realize the amount of time we've got is so small. But I do want to make sure that we can, people can come away with some good ideas and maybe some, different approach to things that can help them in their own individual circumstances. I do want to focus a little bit in terms of how we can recognize some of the common DEI red flags, but then to spend a bit more time in terms of practical actions that we can take to address DEI in our own organizations, in our community. And I also want to use this time to highlight that there is a distinction in terms of the approach and the ideas and the practices, depending on whether you're a small to medium organization or a much larger enterprise. So talking about the common DEI red flags, are there several that you might want to point out right now?
Yeah, I think that the things to watch for I think there are different levels of red flags. So if we're talking about red flags that tell you need to take a DEI approach, include things like realizing that when you look around your workplace, most of the people there look like you. Or most of the people are sitting in a very similar space. The question I like to pose to leaders in organizations is, how often are you challenged to change your thinking in your organization? And how often are you challenged by somebody having a different perspective to you in your organization? And there can be two answers to that if you find yourself you can find yourself being challenged because you have a culture where you encourage people challenging, or you can find yourself being challenged because you have a group of people around you who can bring a perspective that's different to yours, and who can raise something that you haven't thought of. So that's, if you're finding yourself not challenged by people around you, whether that's external people or the people within your own organization, that's a red flag for needing to do something
Yes,
about
ma'am.
this. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
And one of the practical things that I would suggest in terms of that red flag is to start with the self, to always start by doing the work on making sure that you're doing this for the right reasons, that we don't end up with that Black Lives Matter knee-jerk response where people go, oh, my suite of policies doesn't have a DEI. I would like to have some government contracts, like to start exploring that space. Why don't I, whack one in place and then, move on? The thing, and I'm probably going to interleave, I think, red flags and practical outcomes
Sure.
here, because
Absolutely.
they sort of flow from one another. But one of the practical things that you can do, and that flows from a DEI process, is start with self and then with leadership. So DEI has to be driven by the people who set the culture in the organization. And I think, as I said earlier, one of the interesting things is that tends to be management or people in leadership, formal leadership roles in large entities. But in small to medium enterprises, it can be the people who are the culture makers at different levels. So it can be the gregarious person within your sales team who is the one who sets the social agenda for the organization, or the one who is most vocal in speaking about in
Yes.
providing those challenges.
Yep.
How do you bring those people into the discussion? And that can be as simple as when you're doing discussions with people about what their future with the organization looks like, whether it's through a formal review process or just chatting, of bringing that in and saying, what are your thoughts about the way our workforce operates? Do you feel like people have that inclusion element in our workplace? What would you be on board with coming on a journey with us about that, and engaging those people in that discussion? So that culture building piece is the most important, and in some ways, in small to medium enterprises, it's actually a lot easier because you have direct relationships with a larger number of people within your organization. And so being open about why you want to do DEI, and then exploring what sits behind your own sort of assumptions and your own desire to have a DEI program is a really good way of starting that conversation with others, telling people what sort of journey you've been on, what you've found out. There's an awful lot of materials online, so starting that journey actually isn't as daunting as it sounds. Bringing in, a consultant is an option for some people, but if it's not an option for you, or you're still very early and you need more buy-in from other people in your organization before they're going to be prepared to commit resources, then doing that early research yourself and understanding why you want a program is really important. And I think also another practical thing that's become a lot easier recently is to get across the business case for why a DEI program actually matters. So that you've got a firm idea about why it would be good for your organisation. And a good practical example of that I came across recently was a conversation I had with an organisation that simultaneously was talking about whether they should have a DEI program in a way that sounded a bit window dressing-y, like they needed to meet the requirements
Okay.
of those government contract processes.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we're looking to expand into the Chinese market. And so they were advertising for people who had experience in doing business with China and in Chinese markets. And in a way, what they were doing was they had two separate tracks running in their minds. When the window dressing, we want to throw a DEI program together, was not taking into account that they had a real and pressing need for a workplace and a workforce that actually was able to deal with new markets. and was adaptable, and had enough understanding of what working in a new environment looks like, to be able to adapt to a Chinese market. And
Wow.
so understanding that this isn't a process about touchy-feely nice stuff. Although, as a human rights advocate, I'm all in favor of sort of all of us viewing our entities, our corporations, or our small businesses, or even our sole trader work with externals as being community building in a way, because a company is a community. We just don't see it that way.
Yes.
But there's a hard-nosed business case for having a workforce of people who have enough experience between them to be able to go, okay, this is a new adaptive problem that we need to face. How do we deal with that? And so other red flags that can lead to positive outcomes are, if you look around at your workforce and go, well, look, with all the best will in the world, we still haven't got, for example, women in our leadership teams, or we are overwhelmingly white, or we just can't keep certain groups of people. And when I first started law back in the 1990s, the big problem for the top-end law firms that they were all ruminating on was, why can't we keep legal graduates past the 3-year mark? Because they were putting a lot of resourcing into developing clerkship programs and paralegaling programs to bring talent into the organisation. But at 2 to 3 years, they were finding that they were losing a significant proportion of those people that they'd invested time and energy in. And so what they found was that the figures on who was graduating from law schools had shifted significantly, to the point where 50% were female. And so the talent pool that they could draw from was larger. And without realizing it, they'd actually taken big steps towards equalizing the gender disparity that they'd previously had in their graduate intakes. Just because they had access to a bigger pool, because there were more women with law degrees coming out. But what they hadn't done was think about how their processes and their structures for the way the work is done then affected women who were getting to their late 20s as they came into the firms, and then started to have children. And so they started to look for work environments that didn't involve the long hours, or allowed some flexibility, or which allowed them to split parental leave, because back then parental leave wasn't something that was guaranteed in any way. And so that process of looking at the red flag and going, we've got a problem where we're losing a particular group of people in our workforce, why can't we hang on to them? Led law firms at the time to start thinking about, well, what are our processes? Who are the employees we're losing? When they did the numbers and actually looked at who they were losing, it was the women that they were losing. And that allowed them then to start seeing things that had previously been invisible to them about what the experience of being an employee as a junior in those big firms looked like. So the way to the practical process, I think, that comes with that red flag of knowing that you can't keep people is asking, do I actually know what it's like to be an employee of the type that we're losing, that we're not able to find or keep?
That's a great question.
Yeah, and the practical ways to do that are use your exit interviews, really use them. Have them conducted by a third party if necessary, or by somebody who's not connected with that person's employment. Those usual things.
Yeah.
But also to do the numbers, to use the data you've got. And again, that's something where we sort of go, small to medium enterprises find that hard. But in fact, the numbers are actually relatively easy to crunch. It can be harder to see the pattern in a small to medium enterprise, because the numbers are just smaller and you have to see them over time.
Yeah.
But it's worth doing, because that's where you can start to find the elements of unconscious bias that are coming in, the assumption that everybody will work the same way.
Helen, this has been gold. This has been fantastic. We are going to wrap up shortly, but what I wanted to just end with is if you had, people in small, medium-sized businesses kind of looking at this and feeling persuaded and feeling hopeful about the changes that they could put in place, could you share one or two things that you think that they could start with, in terms of an approach or thinking or any practical actions perhaps that they could do?
Yeah. And look, I think it's in a small to medium enterprise, you're often, wildly time pressed. There's less opportunity to be quite as specialized as there is in a large entity. And so that's actually an advantage when it comes to this work, because you're more likely to have a little bit more oversight into what it looks like across your entire organization, rather than somebody who's sitting in a particular role within a large organization who then has to understand what DEI looks like across the business. So keep that advantage in mind when it feels like it's a lot. You're still actually doing, you're in a good position in a small to medium enterprise to be able to implement DEI. Do a little bit of research yourself, and then having worked out what your personal reason for wanting DEI is, then identify who else sets the tone in your organization, who else influences the culture of your organization, and bring them on board as allies. So your task isn't to implement DEI across the organization. Your task is to bring other champions to the table, and then divvy up the work of finding ways to build DEI in your organization. And so don't try and do it yourself, particularly if you're in a small business. If you've got a team of 10 and it tends to be a fairly flat structure, maybe bring everybody in. Maybe have an afternoon where you sit down and explain to people why you think DEI matters. So in effect, what I'm saying is we say DEI in that order, but really start with the inclusion piece, understand the equity piece, why it's important maybe sometimes to do things differently, have a different structure, and free the other people in your organization to make criticisms, to make suggestions, to talk about what their experience has been. And when you get that sort of cultural-led approach to DEI, the rest starts to fall out naturally, because it comes from curiosity rather than from a sense of obligation.
No, that makes good sense. I love the focus on starting with inclusion, and I think building in the elements of psychological safety as well, understanding that you have people of all abilities and making sure that you are finding ways to extract that information, extract their contribution in different ways. I think that will definitely help. Thanks so much, Helen, for coming on today and sharing your experience and your expertise on DEI. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you about this topic, and I really hope that we can continue this discussion offline as well as online through LinkedIn. If viewers are keen to learn more about you and your work, how can they do that?
The easiest way is to go to my website, which is very simply helendalleyfisher.com.au.
Easy.
So have a look and get in contact with me through the site.
Excellent. This was the Thrive Meetup with your host, Rowena Moraes, and featuring my guest, Helen Dalley Fisher. Thank you, Helen, for coming on board. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Thanks, Rowena.